for sure.
Let me start by saying this. I'm going to start with the most important things right off the bat. There's one thing that we can be absolutely certain of scientifically, and it's the following thing. You see, a death is a death, whereas when you try to attribute cause of death, it becomes political. Even when a medical doctor tries to attribute cause of death in a complicated situation like this, where you have comorbidity conditions and everyone's arguing about whether the tests are valid and so on, the attribution of the death, of the cause of death, is typically biased and is very political. And this is well known by epidemiologists. It's always been this way. And it's affected by, what the public is thinking, what the media are saying, and so on. So the way to get around that is to look at total deaths, all-cause death. So we look at all-cause mortality on a per week basis. So every week, how many people die, let's say in Canada or in a given state or in a given province or in a given European country. You look at so you make a graph of the total number of deaths per week as a function of as the weeks advance. And what you find when you do that is that every winter in the mid-latitude countries in Europe and North America, every winter there's a large hump of additional deaths above a kind of summer background. And we can call this the winter burden of deaths. And this is well known. It's always been there. It's always happened. It's true with animals that live in nature, and it's true with humans that live in those mid-latitude countries. So why is that? So science has come to understand that the main reason most probably is because of these darn viruses that have been with us for millions of years that cause respiratory diseases. Because these viruses are transmitted by very small aerosol particles that are suspended in the air. And they can only be suspended in the air effectively and for a long time if the absolute humidity is very low. That's why it happens in the winter. So in winter, all of these viruses, which are very similar one to the next, irrespective of the strain, all of these viruses that cause respiratory diseases are highly contagious and transmit in the winter when the air is dry. That's why you get this extra burden of death, because as soon as you breathe in these aerosols, they infect your lungs and they give you this nasty respiratory disease, then your immune system is in high demand. You have to have a lot of metabolic energy and you have to fight that infection. And that energetic demand in your metabolism is extreme. Your body will even shut down other functions in order to meet that demand. And so anyone who is already fragile and already spending a lot of resources within their body to fight other infections or other conditions is at risk of dying. That's why it's the elderly people who have comorbidity conditions that die under this extra stress of the respiratory disease infection. Okay? So even people who have heart conditions will die as a result of adding on this respiratory disease and so on. So that's why you get this large extra hump in the wintertime. I don't know if you want me to show you what a graph looks like. I think many of you have seen it. I guess I could. Okay, I've got one here. This is what these humps look like, okay? All right, so every winter you get an extra bump of these deaths. This is for the United States as a whole. So that's what the graph looks like as you go year to year every winter like that. And you can see that the extra number of deaths, the extra size of these bumps is always about the same. It's not dramatically different from year to year. These viruses, and there are many, many of them, and they coexist with us, and they always have. If they can be transmitted, they will be transmitted, and they're mutating all the time, and you always get extra deaths in the winter. Okay? So the very first thing, once you understand all that, the very first thing we have to say scientifically on a rigorous basis is this year, this winter, under COVID-19, there have not been more deaths than usual. In other words, the winter burden total deaths has not been greater, statistically speaking. It always varies a little from year to year, But in terms of, is it significantly greater? Is something special happening? It's not. That's the very first point I want to make, is that this is not a killer pathogen that is unusual in terms of how many deaths it causes, nor is it unusual in terms of how it is transmitted, how it acts. It's one of hundreds and hundreds of different viral respiratory disease viruses, and they mutate and they change, and they're always with us. And typically, a person who is infected is often infected, when they analyze it, they find this out, is often infected by more than one of these viruses at any one time. So it's not like you just get one. They're all transmitting, they're all there, and it puts an extra burden on our immune systems in the wintertime. Okay? And so it's just that band of mid-latitude where this transmissivity is high. If you go too far north to very cold, it doesn't transmit anymore. And if you go towards the equator where it's hot and humid, it doesn't transmit. So it's Europe and North America in the northern hemisphere and the mid-latitude countries in the southern hemisphere, but in their winter, which is our summer, okay, when the air is dry there. So they get this extra burden during our summer. And that's normal. This is known. It's been known for decades. It's been studied for decades. It's been explained in the scientific literature for at least a decade in some detail. Okay, so that's the situation. There was never anything unusual or special. Of course, a virologist is always looking to identify a new strain or a new type of virus because they get recognition for that. So there is some institutional and professional rewards for finding a new virus and giving it a name and claiming that you've discovered something and so on. But that's part of what drives this. And in addition, in this case, you've got a strong institutional impetus. You've got a whole apparatus that is waiting for the next new virus to be claimed by some virologist and jump on there if they can, if they see the conditions are right, to call it a pandemic and to make everybody crazy. So they've been preparing this for a while, but they could have done it with anything. And if you could call it anything, and it'll happen every winter, and it won't be a second wave, it'll be the usual winter wave. Okay, it's going to happen again. There will be these kinds of respiratory diseases next winter, and they will be in greater number than they are in the summer, and there will be extra deaths associated with it. It's unavoidable. Okay, so that's the first thing, is that nothing special happened. It was a fake event, if you like, in the sense that it was given a special name and it was used in propaganda to frighten us to think that there was a particularly dangerous thing happening that was very unusual and unseen previously. That's all a big lie. Okay, I'm personally very convinced of this. I've looked at all the data, read so many of the articles as they come out. This has been a huge fabrication. Okay, that was the first point I wanted to make. The second point is also important, and it's the following point. I said that the humps are always about the same size, which means the total burden of death in the winter is always about the same. However, in some jurisdictions, in some states, and in some European countries, there is an extra very sharp peak. I don't know if you can see it on this graph here, but it looks like you've got the hump, and then all of a sudden there's this very, very fine, sharp peak that shoots up. And I've called that the COVID peak. And so I wrote a big paper to try to analyze where does that peak come from and what's it due to. So the area of the peak is not big because it's so narrow. So you don't have a total number of extra deaths that's significant. But there is that peak there. So it means that there was an acceleration of the deaths at that point. A lot of people died very quickly within about 3 or 4 weeks. That's the width of that peak. And it was a very dramatic event in some jurisdictions, only where they did certain things. Okay? So when I look at that peak in the data across the world where they're reporting this kind of data, what I found was that the peak kicks in, starts up always at exactly the same time, no matter where you are in the world. It fires up immediately after the pandemic was declared. Okay? Week 11 of the season, week 11 of the year, they declare the pandemic. The World Health Organization tells all the states, you have to get ready for this catastrophe. People are going to flood the hospitals. You have to get your hospitals ready. We're telling you now it's a pandemic. And immediately, as soon as they said that, didn't matter where you were on the world, on the planet, cross oceans and everything, synchronously, everybody at the same time had the start of that very sharp, large peak, which was an extra number of deaths. So what I concluded in my paper, and this peak is not natural. A peak like this has never been seen for any of these respiratory viruses, okay? It's not natural for the following reasons. It's too narrow. A viral infection of this type that normally spreads in a society will never be that narrow. You always get these broader peaks. Even the sharper features that you see in this curve from winter to winter, when you do have a sharper feature, the width of that is much greater. The half width at half maximum, we call it, is much greater than this COVID peak. So it's typically more like 12 or 14 weeks rather than 3 or 4 weeks. So it's too narrow to be a natural peak, and it's happening synchronously everywhere at the same time, which is crazy. It can't be an accident. And it's happening too late in the season. There has never been, in the recorded history of mortality, there's never been a sharp peak like this late in the winter season, anywhere, at any time. So it's a completely artificially created situation where immune vulnerable people, their deaths were accelerated by what we did to them. And what did we do to them? Well, we isolated them from their families. We closed them into institutions. We closed the doors of the institutions. We didn't let the air come out. The air filled with these aerosol particles containing the virus, and we basically infected them all by closing them in and stressing them more than they would be normally because they were isolated, they were not cared for as well, and their family couldn't see them. And they were frightened by the fact that there was this horrible pandemic that they were hearing about. Now, that kind of psychological stress is known scientifically to be a major cause of faulty immune responses and other diseases, causing other diseases as well. So you don't do that, and they did it. And so I believe that's the mechanism whereby they accelerated the deaths of immune deficient, fragile people who would have died in the many weeks and months later, eventually in a natural way, but instead they accelerated their deaths by doing this. That's my conclusion of what happened there. And what's interesting is that you don't get this peak in some of the states in the United States. There are large states where there's no sign of this peak, this unusual peak, and other states where it's very prominent, like in New York. Okay, I'm getting a message that my internet connection is unstable, so I hope you can still hear me. So so far I've made 2 points. One is this is not an unusual killer, and point 2 is governments did intervene in a way that was reckless and that killed people basically because it accelerated their deaths. Now, in a situation like that, the government is going to want to hide its crimes. This is criminal, and it's irresponsible, and it was not based on science, and they didn't use their own experts. They went on what the World Health was saying. They relied on that authority information, and so it's starting to get close to a criminal act, and so you need to cover that up. And how do you cover that up? You convince everyone that this really was a dangerous pandemic. What's the best way to convince everybody that we really had a killer here, that we came close to all dying and so on? What's the best way? Well, convince them that they have to wear a face mask If you as an individual are so frightened that you're going to go and put a face mask on in the middle of summer, you are personally investing in the belief of that lie. And that is a powerful psychological way of convincing you that there was this danger and that what we need to do to save ourselves is to wear that masks, and the government didn't do anything wrong and they did the best they could, and thank God they told us what to do. And so the mask, I believe that this is the reason the establishment is so vehement about wearing masks and is so stuck on this mask idea, because it is a way to invest us personally into this lie and to get us acting this way. And when you see, people think that what you believe motivates what you're going to do, your action, but it also works the other way. Your action largely creates what you believe. Okay, if you agree to do something because someone is scaring you or convincing you with false arguments, the fact of doing it, you're going to be believing that lie. So I think that's what the masks are about. Um, so that's pretty much those are the main points that I wanted to make. I'm not wearing a mask. I took the public transit the other day in Ottawa. I didn't wear a mask, and I was ready to make my arguments. And I think people could see that they were not going to convince me to wear a mask. The attendants and the people who were told to educate us, they didn't come near me. They just turned around and went away. I don't know if I had rays in my eyes or what, um, but you know what I did see? I did notice something that I'll share this with you. I did notice something that shows you how irresponsible the governments are, because they've got us so frightened. People are wearing masks in the transit system. They're going underground. They're going into the subways. They're wearing masks. They're frightened. And then when it's time to take the escalator, which is this high escalator, they're not holding the ramp. You have people of a certain age who are so afraid they won't touch anything, and they're not holding the ramp in this huge steel escalator that's shaking and everything, and they're above me, and I'm trying to get out of the subway, and I'm thinking, God, are they going to fall on me? And they could kill themselves. And systematically, the people who are wearing masks are also not making every effort they can not to hold the rail. It's dangerous. It's a real, so that's just one example that you can see of a negative side effect of this fear and of this stupidity, is that you're putting people at risk in this way. So, and there are many, many unforeseen consequences like that when you start to make these draconian changes in society. So I'm going to stop talking now, and I would be really happy to answer questions if you have questions.